Yesterday, my dad shared with me a tape of my grandmother from when my dad was in college. My dad was 18 years old at the time and had just moved away to go to college. And so he and my grandmother would send each other tapes back and forth so they could have longer conversations than they would be able to have over the phone. And in the tape, my grandmother, who at the time was doing some teaching, was talking about how one of her students asked her about why it is that Judaism is a religion that doesn't give you answers. Why it is that, if you're Buddhist, you can find answers to your questions, but if you're Jewish, many times we just say there are some things that God does that we don't understand. And she was talking about it, and she was saying, if Jews believe that other religions have it higher, we're fooling ourselves, because God, in Judaism, Hashem, is at such a high level that we can't understand. We don't understand God's logic because it's above ourselves. So if we stoop to a level where we can understand our own answers to questions, then that is a lower level than for things that are so great that we don't have the capacity to understand them.
In Sunday school, we had a discussion, and his complaint was that our religion doesn't answer the questions that we ask, and just says you have to have faith or it's God's will. And he says no wonder people team up with all these other religious sects, because they do get their questions answered. So I gave an example, like taking a geometry class is very difficult to grasp all the theories, and it would be much easier to just go into an algebra class or remain in an algebra class, because there you could get all the answers or understand and comprehend everything that's given to you. And that's why I believe that, of course, being Yiddish and maintaining the religion is certainly a challenge, because we do not have all the answers, and because we must understand that there are things that we cannot comprehend because we're human, and so many solutions can only be had on a superhuman level, which is certainly not within our realm. But if we were to go to any other religion to seek answers, we would actually be stooping. Well, wow, boy, they really exploded why I would call going to another religion stooping. So I had to emphasize that the other religion itself, for the people in it, is not stooping for them. I mean, to them it's as important as ours is to ours. But for us to leave something because we do not comprehend it, because it's greater than we are, and to go to something that would feed us the answers that we want to hear on our own level, would be stooping, because actually, rather than raising ourselves up to something higher, we would be lowering ourselves to hear what we can comprehend. Well, anyway.
And it reminded me of this week's Parsha, which is Parsha Vayeira, which is the fourth chapter, the fourth Parsha in the book of Bereshit. And in this week's Parsha, we have a few instances where God makes miracles happen. Whatever people believe is impossible, there's no such thing as impossible, because with God, there's only possible. We as humans can have doubts and we cannot understand something, but that does not make it impossible. So the first instance of this in this week's Parsha is that Sarah and Abraham, Sarah at the time is 90 years old, give birth to a son, to their son Isaac. And it's a miracle. It really is. This 90-year-old woman and her husband Abraham, who have been childless for most of their lives up until Abraham married Hagar and they had Ishmael. Abraham was a childless man, and Sarah still to this point doesn't have any children. And God blesses them with a child, with a baby boy. And the reaction when Sarah hears and when Abraham hears in last week's Parsha that they're going to have a son, both of them laugh, because they just cannot fathom that this is a possibility. To them, it seems impossible. But here's the first instance of where we see that impossible is really possible with God's help and guidance. The second instance of this is when, after Isaac is born, Sarah starts to observe the interactions between Ishmael and Isaac and decides it is not the best thing for Isaac if Ishmael and Hagar remain in the home. So she asks Abraham to send them away, which he does. Now he sends them away, and now Hagar and Ishmael are in the desert, and they've been wandering, and they don't know where they're going. And Ishmael and Hagar are running out of water. They're thirsty. It's very hot in the desert. And Hagar leaves Ishmael to die, basically. They run out of water. There's no water in their flask. And she leaves him. She doesn't want to watch him as he suffers. And God comes to Hagar, and he shows her a source of water, and she fills up for their flask for her son Ishmael to drink, and he survives and becomes a great nation of his own. Another miracle, the impossible. You're in the desert. There's no water where they are in the desert, but God reveals to Hagar this source, this body of water that gives them life. Another version of something impossible in the desert and finding water to possible. God gives her a source of water. And the third instance I want to talk about that we see in this week's Parsha is where we have Akirat Yitzchak, which is the binding of Isaac. And it's really a miracle, this one. We talked about last week how God gave Abraham this series of tests. There was 10 tests in total, and last week we talked about the first test. And this is the 10th test of Abraham. Now, Abraham and Sarah had wanted a son, had wanted their own child for so long. And after 90 years, they finally have a son, and the son is growing up and is a man now. And God comes to Abraham and tells him he needs to slaughter his son, and make his son into an offering. And Abraham, it's obviously a heart-wrenching decision, but he decides he's going to do it. He's going to listen to God. He's going to slaughter his son. He's really his only son. Again, at this point, Ishmael is not really in the picture, and it's still the only son with his wife. And so Abraham takes Isaac, and they go together. Isaac, the commentators suggest, was aware of his fate, and yet they still are going together in one unit. And the commentators, the sources also suggest that Isaac asked his father to bind him to the altar so that he wouldn't inadvertently hurt his father when his father was trying to slaughter him. And right before, this is one of those other hopeless moments where now Isaac is bound on this altar, and Abraham has the knife and is ready to slaughter his only child. And God's voice comes to Isaac and tells him to stop and not to kill his son. This is just an incredible instance of something that seems impossible, something that seems hopeless. Your child is right before you, about to die, and God saves him. God stops this horrible thing from happening, and it's another instance of impossible reality, impossible fate becoming possible. God saves him. God takes this horrible instance and makes it into something very beautiful. And so many times in our lives, we look at something and we say, that's not possible, that's impossible, it couldn't be, we can't do this, I can't do this, you can't do this, you're not capable. But clearly, with God's help, we are capable of making anything that we could possibly imagine possible. There's no such thing as the impossible, because clearly these instances, these 3 instances in this week's Parsha, show just how possible anything is when you have faith in God. My wish for all of you is that you can recognize that God is with you, and that you should have faith in God and in the possibilities that living a life with Hashem creates. And I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to speaking with you next week. Shabbat Shalom.